Donald Trump flew all the way to the French countryside to a World War I cemetery in honor of the troops who fought in that war. Although he didn't quite make it, he made it to a hotel in Paris and ultimately called off his participation in the event because it was raining, and instead he watched television. Winston Churchill's grandson, Nicholas Soames, who's a member of the British Parliament, blasted Trump as pathetic and inadequate for failing to show up. This is disrespectful to the troops, to their families. Trump said he'd be the best on the military. That's not happening. This is disrespectful to every American taxpayer who bears the cost of this trip for Trump to sit around watching television and tweeting. Here are German and French leaders, Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron, both apparently able to brave the brutal rain and stand there for a few minutes between limo rides. Rain, not something that would stop Trump from golfing, however. Here's a picture of Donald Trump playing golf in the rain. That certainly didn't seem to deter him there. But honoring the troops after traveling all the way to Europe in the rain, apparently just too much to ask. Is there any bigger snowflake than this guy? 93-year-old Queen Elizabeth II had no problem whatsoever making it out to all of the events of the day. And it's really not at all surprising when you think back to Trump being the guy who got a deferment out of Vietnam because his foot hurt. Later, he couldn't remember which foot it was. Maybe it was both of them. Who even knows? Who even really cares, right? And if you want a manly president, this is not something I care about, okay? But there are many Trump supporters who are all about Obama was beta and Trump is alpha. By your own standards, you've got to be missing Obama at this point, right? Here is President Obama greeting supporters in the rain. Here he is giving a speech with no umbrella in the rain. Here is President Obama honoring fallen soldiers in the rain with no umbrella, mind you. And I could go on. And imagine for a second, what would right-wingers have done if President Obama had done this? Can you even imagine? Because it would have been a far bigger scandal than the time Obama chose the wrong mustard for the cuisine he was eating. It would be worse than the time Obama wore a tan suit on a day when he was scheduled to deal with serious issues. Trump bragged, remember, that he would have run into the high school in Parkland, Florida, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, during that mass shooting, if only he had been there. And he can't even honor the troops in the rain, and we're supposed to believe he would have run into a building with an active shooter to defend high schoolers. Can anybody answer me this question, Pat? What's more disrespectful, kneeling during the national anthem before a football game, or refusing to go out in the rain after flying to Europe on a trip meant to honor the troops because it's sprinkling and you might get wet?
Well, you know me, I would certainly say the latter, but I do have the explainer for this, and it's Trump's hair. He can't afford to get that thing wet. Now, you could say that the man could use an umbrella, but we have video evidence showing that he actually doesn't know how to close the umbrella, so there's no way he could have possibly made this event. I mean, just the hairstyle alone, that meerkat for a hairstyle, not going to allow him to do it.
We're going to get to the geopolitical implications of this, but this guy is pathetic. He mocked John McCain for being captured in the military. He says that he made sacrifices just like Gold Star families have done, and the guy doesn't go out in the rain. He respects dictators and himself, period. That is it. And I'm getting lots of emails from people saying, David, is it even really necessary for the president to go to Europe to commemorate 100 years of the end of World War I? Like, it's not even clear that his presence was necessary. You can have that debate. I agree that Trump's presence wasn't necessary, but this event is actually a pretty big deal in the UK and in Europe. And the important thing here is that if you decide to go and then you actually make it there, go to the event. Don't sit in your hotel room watching TV because it's raining while a 93-year-old queen is able to make it out there. This is the most beta of beta, totally triggered snowflake, and it's an absolute embarrassment to this country. And we're going to be talking about that extensively later today. I've got a piece I'm planning for you tomorrow about how world leaders are just sick of Trump's BS, and they're making it clear that they're sick of Trump's BS. This is sort of, it's a story that is about a micro issue that's going on, but it actually is emblematic of so much of what's wrong with this guy, and we're going to be talking about it. Okay, let's get to an update on the Jim Acosta story. Jim Acosta is a CNN reporter. He asked questions of Donald Trump, which I know to many of you will not come as a shock since that's what many reporters do. And Donald Trump didn't like the questions. And during this question and answer period, there was an incident where a White House intern started to try to physically remove the microphone from Jim Acosta. While Trump and Acosta were arguing, Acosta's arm got tangled up with the interns. Here's the original clip that started all of this.
Of miles away. That's not an invasion.
Honestly, I think you should let me run the country. You run CNN.
All right.
And if you did it well, your ratings would be much better.
If I may ask one other question, Mr. President, if I may ask one other question, are you worried?
That's enough. That's enough.
Mr. President, I was going to ask one of the other folks.
That's enough.
Pardon me, ma'am. Mr. President,
that's enough.
Mr. President, I had one other question, if I may ask, on the Russia investigation. Are you concerned that you may have?
I'm not concerned about anything with the Russian
investigation
because it's a hoax. That's enough. Put down the mic.
Mr. President, are you worried about indictments coming down in this investigation?
Mr. President.
I'll tell you what, CNN should be ashamed of itself having you working for them. You are a rude, terrible person.
Yeah, so then after this, the story from the White House became, we are getting rid of Jim Acosta from these briefings because he put his hands on a woman. And then video was released, which was apparently edited in a way to make it seem as though the moment where the arms get tangled between Acosta and the intern was a moment of Jim Acosta being violent in some way with this intern. And we reported on the video when it first came out. It appeared quite a bit as though there was something up with it. And it seems that it was sort of a combination of speeding up the moment where Jim Acosta's arm goes in a downward direction with potentially even removing some frames to make that downward motion look sort of more aggressive. And we now have an interview that Trump advisor Kellyanne Conway gave on Fox News Sunday, where she admits that this video was indeed edited, but she called it not edited, not altered, not doctored, simply sped up. And her language here is completely Orwellian. And I'm going to play it for you, and then we'll talk about it. Take a look.
This brings me to my final subject, which is the now infamous confrontation with Jim Acosta at that news conference. As you know, I have been very critical of Acosta's behavior myself, but I want to ask you about two responses by the White House. First, to tweet a video that was clearly altered to make it look like it was more of a physical confrontation than it really was, although I do think it was inappropriate. And second, to pull Acosta's pass to get into the White House and to threaten to do that to other reporters.
Well, Chris, first of all, what do you mean by edited or, as others are saying, quote, doctored video? He either put his hands on her and grabbed the mic back, or he did not, and he clearly did.
No, he clearly did, but the video was altered, and there are experts who have looked at it to make it look, speed it up to make it look, pardon?
Oh, well, that's not altered. That's sped up. They do it all the time in sports to see if there's actually a first down or a touchdown. So I have to disagree with the, I think, overwrought description.
Listen, I watch a lot of sports on TV. Has she ever seen sports on TV? In sports, you do slow motion to see what happened. You don't do fast motion. Like, have you ever seen referees, Pat, say, you know, we really didn't get a clear look at that. Can you show us a replay in 2x speed so that we can really figure out what's going on? Like, this is one of the dumbest explanations so far.
The only thing I can think of is like on a highlight reel, if you're showing a football player making a 90-yard run, maybe you'll speed that up because the clip takes a little bit of time. But if you're trying to focus in on something like, I don't know, a fumble or whether a runner was safe or out at the plate, You want to slow that down so the public can actually get a look at what happened.
Yeah, the idea that you would speed something up to ascertain what actually took place is ridiculous. And of course, this is part of the words have no meaning thing anymore. Kellyanne Conway of the Bowling Green Massacre, which didn't exist, of alternative fact, which of course it's sort of binary. Something either is a fact or it is not a fact. It was sped up at a particular moment to create a different perception of what it is that took place, period. The idea that changing the speed of a video is irrelevant because it's just the playback speed is ridiculous. Imagine, Your Honor, there's no way I was speeding. Check out this video of me driving at the time, right before I was pulled over. Look at how slowly I'm moving. Well, that video has clearly been altered. No, Your Honor, it's not been altered. I've simply slowed the video down. Well, yeah, what's at issue is how fast you were driving. So slowing the video down is an alteration. That's what's at issue here. They can't be trusted to tell the truth about anything, like stupid things, irrelevant things, important things. They can't be relied upon to give us the truth about anything. And in the end, why not just say, you know what? The video was altered. We regret sharing an altered video put together by a conspiracy website, but we believe that Jim Acosta's behavior is what was inappropriate. It's not the speed at which he chopped a female intern's arm. We simply don't want him around because we think that his presence is toxic. Like, Pat, why not just say that? You don't need doctored video to defend your decision. Some people are going to be happy with your decision to kick him out. Others are going to say, let's file a lawsuit, which is exactly what CNN has done and we'll talk about tomorrow. But it's not that the video is even necessary for them to do what they want.
Oh, you can totally concede that the video was altered and still try to feign the moral high ground in that exchange, because they could still say that Jim Acosta acted inappropriately, and that's not the demeanor that you expect from the White House press corps. You can go in that direction, but Kellyanne Conway, she has to stick to it.
Doubling down time and again with just absolute and total fabrications. Welcome to the show, and what a show we have for you today. Let's start with projection and voting. The level at which the right is projecting their actions onto the left has really come to a head on the topic of this recent Florida election and subsequent recount that is going on. It is now being reported that a heavily Republican county in Florida has allowed some residents, wait for it, to vote by email, which you might be wondering about. And yes, indeed, that is against the law. I'm going to reset the entire story for you so that we all sort of have all of the same information on which to base our analysis. So let's go back a couple of years. For years now, the right has been saying we need voter ID. We need all sorts of other voter suppression policies because of voter fraud, mostly perpetrated by the left, they said. People are voting for others. People are voting twice. Dead people are voting. Not really. Live people are going and saying they are people who have actually died. The reality is that that's not a problem, okay? There's been a huge meta-analysis by the Brennan Center for Justice, which found that there were, in something like 1.3 billion ballots cast, around 30 individual instances of fraud over like a 14-year period or something like that. I mean, the numbers were just infinitesimally small. So we cut to last week. The Florida elections happen. It's very close in the Senate race. It's very close in the gubernatorial race. And you see on election night, Republicans in the lead. Rick Scott in the Senate and Ron DeSantis apparently winning on election night. We then find out that there are a whole bunch of ballots which simply haven't been counted, many of them found at a mail handling facility in a liberal part of the state, Miami-Dade County, irregularities in Broward County, another one of the three sort of big blue counties of Florida that are responsible for a lot of the Democratic vote in these elections. We've got questionable ballots that voting machines disqualified that we need to look at by hand to really get a final tally. Republicans immediately say, oh, this is voter fraud by Democrats. They're sort of implying that Democrats dropped off bags of ballots after the election was over. at a mail facility. And of course, there's no evidence of foul play or fraud. And if Democrats had a plan of swinging the election with bags of paper ballots, they would have, number one, gotten them in before Election Day actually took place. And number two, they probably wouldn't have dropped them off in a liberal area, since that would attract exactly this type of attention. So if Democrats are trying to steal the election with paper ballots dropped off late in a blue area, they are really doing something very stupid by way of, or in the hopes of swinging the election fraudulently. So over the last few days, we've had Republicans doing everything they can to oppose the recounts. Donald Trump claiming voter fraud with no evidence. Sean Hannity on Fox News saying someone should go to jail for this. And we've now learned that in a very Republican county in Florida, this is Bay County, where in 2016, Donald Trump had 71% of the vote in the presidential election. The election supervisor in Bay County, his name's Mark Anderson, he has admitted, he's not even denying, that he has allowed people to vote by email. This is against the law. This is not allowed. Now, you can argue we should have voting by email in the United States. We should have electronic voting. Or you could argue that we shouldn't. But what you can't argue is that we don't. So this is against the law. This is a form of fraudulent voting that the election supervisor has admitted to. Why did this happen? They say that it's because of the hurricane, but it's just not adding up, because after the hurricane on October 10th, Rick Scott, who is not only the senator-elect in Florida, he's also the governor, he put out an executive order saying we're going to extend early voting, we're going to add early voting locations, but no votes can be submitted by email or fax. Like, he specifically addressed that issue. And people were allowed by the election supervisor to scan or take pictures of their ballots and email them in. And the election supervisor is defending it by saying we are simply taking care of voters. Pat, what about taking care of voters by making it easier to vote? What about taking care of voters by expanding voting locations or early voting, not because of a hurricane, but just because it's the right thing to do, or not purging voter rolls? No, they don't do any of that stuff. But now they want to help voters by allowing a Republican county to vote by email, which is against the law.
Yeah, sounds to me like voter fraud. And I estimate that anywhere from 3 to 5 million people voted illegally. My thought is that we have to put together a voter integrity commission to really get down to the bottom of this, because Democrats should have won both of these races.
It makes more sense here than it did after the 2016 election, that's for sure, because these are hundreds of instances of what Donald Trump claimed 3 to 5 million people did in 2016 without any actual evidence. And just as, while we're talking about Trump, Trump said he would prosecute all election fraud. Voting by email is a form of election fraud. Is it going to be prosecuted? I guess Rick Scott was right. There actually was a voter fraud problem here, but not in Miami-Dade County, not in Broward County, in heavily Republican Bay County. You cannot write this stuff. I know that I've said this before, Pat, that the most embarrassing and ignorant thing that Trump has done on the national stage just happened. And then a week goes by, and then once again I say, okay, now Trump has done the most embarrassing thing. And usually it's true, because we think we've hit the top, or sometimes it's rock bottom, and then he does something worse. He might outdo himself in the future indefinitely. And that is where we are today. There's a stunning report in France's newspaper Le Monde, which alleges that Donald Trump did two mind-blowing things in April. So in April, Donald Trump met with the leaders of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. Now, if you hear those three countries and think, oh, there's something about those three countries as a group. Yes, they're called the Baltic states. These are three countries in Northern Europe that are now independent countries on the Baltic Sea, previously subject to USSR rule, I guess we could call it. I was in one of those countries over the summer, Estonia. Absolutely beautiful place, fantastic people, amazing architecture, culture, great food. Those three countries are the Baltic countries. Donald Trump confused them in front of their leaders with the Balkans. Now, the Balkans are not the Baltic countries. The Balkans are in a different part of Europe, about 1,000 miles away. They include Albania, Bulgaria, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, Macedonia, Montenegro. They ended up in their current state after the early 90s breakup of Yugoslavia. And geographically, you could say that the peninsula, the Balkan Peninsula, includes pieces of some other countries as well. Donald Trump confused the Baltics and the Balkans. And then he said something that made absolutely no sense. And according to this report in Newsweek, the leaders of the three Baltic states were just sort of confused, looking around like, what the hell is this guy talking about? And then they realized that Trump thinks that they are from the Balkans, not the Baltics. And what Trump said was that they are responsible for starting wars that led to the breakup of Yugoslavia in 1991. Can you imagine you're the president of Estonia or Latvia, whichever one of these countries? You are, you've come out of the USSR, you've rebuilt the country. Your country is a sort of beacon of success in a region that has had many political and economic problems. In Estonia, one of the most technologically advanced democracies in the world, you get invited to the White House. Wow, President of the United States, you fly halfway around the world, and the president says to you, you did a bad thing when you started that war that broke up Yugoslavia. And then you realize the guy has no idea where you're from. An absolute and total embarrassment. And Pat, this is what you get when you combine ignorance and anti-intellectualism with a political movement that sees that as a virtue and enshrines ignorant anti-intellectuals as leaders. You get the leaders of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania saying, what the hell is the president talking about right now?
And let's remember, it's been the U.S. that has been starting the wars in recent memory, namely the war in Iraq. But yeah, Trump just is not very good with geography. He referred to Namibia, the country in Africa, as Nambia. He doesn't understand the differences between the United Kingdom and Great Britain and England. He thinks those things are interchangeable. They're all the same. Yeah, he should just study up, I think. That's what it comes down to.
The right loves to slam the left for language policing, but they do their own language policing. And then the right likes to slam the left for identity politics. But then you realize, wait a second, the entire Trumpist movement, the alt-right, these are identity movements, and they happen to be horrible identity movements. And then the right likes to slam the left for virtue signaling, which they do just as much, if not more of, except with horrible virtues like those of dogmatic religious belief and anti-education ideas. They always defend this stuff the same way. Listen, Trump's not a lifelong politician. He can't know everything. He's making the right decisions, and that's what actually matters. If you're president, you get held to the same standards as other presidents. And misstating the wars that other countries have started, not knowing what countries' leaders you're even meeting with, these aren't like niche micro criticisms. This is basic stuff that's truly pathetic, and it's not making America great again. This is an absolute and total embarrassment. I have just genuinely good news for you today. Last week, I reported to you that in the midterm elections, Republican Martha McSally won against Democratic Congresswoman Kyrsten Sinema. That has changed. Since election night, they've been counting uncounted ballots, which you should do if the ballots are valid. And as it turns out, those uncounted ballots were disproportionately from the blue parts of Arizona. And Sinema took what is now an insurmountable lead and has defeated Republican Martha McSally conceding. So Republicans will still control the Senate with a majority, but by one fewer, or is it one less seat or one fewer seat than we thought? In either case, they're going to have not as many seats as they believed they were going to have. And very interestingly, when it comes to Kyrsten Sinema specifically, number one, the last time that Arizona even had a Democratic senator was in 1995 with Dennis DeConcini. And that is notable. Also notable that Kyrsten Sinema, she appears to be the first U.S. senator elected who formally says she has no religious affiliation. And we can all sort of understand that there were and are very likely some senators who are not actually religious, but they still say, I am Christian, statistically speaking, or maybe I am Jewish in the case of some. So this is not literally the first non-religious person, but it is the first senator who formally states that she is not part of any organized religion. And this is why you've got to fight every race and count every ballot. If we had accepted, Pat, on election day that this was it and not continued to push, she might not have won. We now have updated midterm results. It's good for Democrats. And this is why we have to make sure that every single ballot, Pat, is counted in Florida, because it might not change the results, but it might.
Yeah, and Kyrsten Sinema, she's not the most progressive person out there, but hey, it is Arizona after all, and I'd rather see a Democrat win that seat than a Republican. And it looks like the Republican majority in the Senate is going to be 53 to 47. That makes it slightly easier for Democrats to take back the Senate in 2020. That road now becomes a lot more possible.
And I want to talk about in the context of 2020. So last week when I gave sort of my analysis of the results, which were this was pretty good for Democrats given the circumstances, but at the same time, I understand wanting more because we have such an outrageous administration right now. And I get it. When you see this cartoonish disaster that we have in the White House right now, you think, wow, if people understand what's going on, we should be absolutely crushing. And we had a situation where the Senate was stacked against us. Just slightly losing really isn't that bad when you consider that. In the House, Democrats have, as of right now, picked up 32 seats. This may not be the overwhelming victory some wanted, but the truth is that this is the most seats that Democrats have picked up in a midterm election, in any election, in the House in a very long time. I don't even remember exactly when the last time was that Democrats had plus 32 in an election in the House, but this is a good result. The Democrats won the popular vote in the House by 5 million votes. They won the popular vote in the Senate by about 14 million, if I recall correctly, and if you account for the fact that for Dianne Feinstein's seat, you had 2 Democrats running, you can take away all of Kevin DeLeon's votes. I think it was about 2.5, 3 million. You still have Democrats receiving 11 million more votes in Senate races than Republicans. So there's now a very clear set of goals for 2020. The Senate is going to be tough, even though the map is in some ways better for Democrats in the Senate in 2020, because Democrats are going to have more safe seats than Republicans. The Republican seats, as Pat pointed out last week, are mostly in some pretty red states. You're almost definitely, I think, Pat, going to lose Alabama back to Republicans. You had a serial child sex assaulter who only lost by a few points. Any reasonable person is probably, and by reasonable, I mean not a serial accused sex assaulter, Democrats will probably lose Alabama, but there is a path to controlling the Senate there.
That is true. Democrats will probably lose Alabama, but hey, they can probably beat Cory Gardner in Colorado. They might be able to beat Joni Ernst in Iowa, Tom Tillis, he's vulnerable in North Carolina, and Susan Collins, our good old friend from Maine. I think she could lose that race as well.
So the point is, you've got to fight every seat. You have to fight for every vote. And until all the votes are actually counted, you aren't done. And we will see what we ultimately hear about the recounts that are currently taking place in Florida. And that's actually what I want to talk about next. The US dollar has a pretty privileged position among world currencies, which is good for the United States because it's a trading currency. It's a reserve currency in many parts of the world. So it's not just within the United States that the dollar is used. It's used by countries all over the world for transactions between many other countries. 40 to 45% of international payments happen in dollars. 2/3 of global reserves are in dollars. 2/3 of physical dollar bills are outside of the United States. This global reliance on the dollar keeps interest rates low, which is good for our economy. it's really easy to sell U.S. bonds because a lot of the world is already operating in dollars. And trading with other countries, meaning imports and exports, trading with other countries is one step easier for the United States because our currency happens to be one that's already being used by many other countries. But the consequences would be bigger than just these numbers if the United States dollar were no longer such a prominent currency. We have clout economically around the world and diplomatically around the world because of the prevalence of our currency being used by different countries. The world wants dollars, which makes American exports worth more. This is where we get to the current administration. Unfortunately, under Donald Trump, under this increased geopolitical, economic, diplomatic instability that has surfaced under Trump, we're seeing the world start to move away from US dollars more and more. And it is really important to understand this. We might feel as though, obviously, the dollar is the currency of the world. There's nothing fixed or immutable about that. It might seem like dollars are at the top of the food chain, but the reason for that is a lot of what I've told you, and the fact that the U.S. has been seen as a sort of stable geopolitical player that can be trusted to stick to our agreements, to be present in our alliances. That's increasingly in question. And there are two sort of unrelated ways in which Donald Trump is causing this self-inflicted demise of the dollar. Number one is that the status of the U.S. around the world as untrustworthy hurts our credibility. This includes Trump backing out of agreements for no good reason. This includes, the Iran deal, the Paris climate deal. That's the sort of geopolitical attack on the dollar that we're seeing. Then there's the economic one. Trump's tariffs, for example, by virtue of how they impact our allies, push other countries to say, maybe we don't want to be dealing in the dollar. The dollar starts to become a risk for other countries to hold rather than a stable mechanism. And then we get to one of the most interesting aspects of this. Donald Trump has been talking about how the trade deficit is really a bad thing, meaning when we have a trade deficit, we are importing more than we are exporting, or we are buying more than we're selling. We're consuming more than we are producing. What that means is that we have to borrow at the country level to pay for a lot of that stuff that we're consuming. That means more dollars are going out than dollars coming in. That's why there are all these dollars floating around the world that other countries use for transactions and make it easier for them to use the dollar as their reserve currency. If Trump succeeds in getting rid of our trade deficit, the number of extra dollars around the world goes way down, which hurts our clout as a reserve currency. Basic economics. And very quickly, this starts to get into way more sort of advanced economics than certainly Trump can understand. But the point is that the same trade deficit that Donald Trump claims to want to get rid of to help the United States would actually be even more damaging to the US dollar if he did it. He claims to be a nationalist. That's his word. If that's the case, why is he advocating a policy that would be bad for the US dollar, the national currency, which I would imagine nationalists would want to support? Send me your thoughts on that. We're going to talk more about it on upcoming programs. Okay, let's talk about the attacks on democracy that have been fomented by the Republican Party. We've seen Russian interference in our elections and a lack of willingness from Republicans to do a damn thing about it. We've seen voter suppression tactics and fake stories about voter fraud and 3 to 5 million illegal votes. And we've seen the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. I mean, really serious attacks on the democratic institutions of the United States and on democracy and voting itself. Over the weekend, a report from the Miami New Times was published, and it says that there are a ton of uncounted ballots from Florida, which are just sitting in a mail handling facility for Miami-Dade County, which is, by the way, a consistently Democratic voting county in Florida. The specific details are still blurry. It's not totally clear why the ballots were just sitting at the mail handling facility. It's not clear exactly when they were postmarked, which would determine whether they're eligible to be counted or not. It's unclear whether they were delayed because the MAGA bomber was actually sent a pipe bomb through this facility. The facility was evacuated. And is that maybe responsible for the delay? We don't know. But what we do know is that these ballots could conceivably have impacted the Florida gubernatorial race between Democratic candidate Andrew Gillum and Republican Ron DeSantis. These held up ballots from a very blue part of Florida could have impacted the Senate race between Republican Rick Scott and incumbent Democrat Bill Nelson. So as all this is going on, Donald Trump says that the counting of these ballots is voter fraud. He tries to be clever, but he actually sounds very ignorant on Twitter when he says, quote, "You mean they are just now finding votes in Florida and Georgia, but the election was on Tuesday? Let's blame the Russians and demand an immediate apology from President Putin." There is no evidence whatsoever that these ballots were forged or that any ballots were forged. Donald Trump here is lying without evidence about the integrity of our elections. This is far more dangerous than lying about the number of people that attended his inauguration. These are lies meant to give people false beliefs about the integrity of one of the most important democratic systems we have in the country, that of voting. And it wasn't just Trump, because then Sean Hannity on Fox News interviews the Republican candidate Rick Scott, who is also Florida governor. And Hannity says someone should be in jail for the ballot counting. And if you're watching this clip, you'll notice that Governor Rick Scott nods, agreeing with Hannity. Yes, someone should be in jail for counting people's ballots. Take a look at this.
I've never seen anything like this in my life. It is obviously corrupt. Obviously, laws were broken. Obviously, there are shenanigans here. I believe you and Senator Rubio are 100% correct. We will follow this every single second of every day now.
Yeah.
Because the people of Florida deserve their just vote, which they got. And you won this race hands down. And this is a disgrace that they get to do this election in, election out. Somebody needs to go to jail here if this keeps happening. You keep violating the law. You don't respond. Every other county responds.
Someone needs to go to jail, says Sean Hannity, and Rick Scott just nods. So what do they claim is so wrong with what's going on? Well, they're saying that finding these ballots is the scam, that once the Democrats realized they lost these two races in Florida, they found these bogus, fake, fraudulent ballots. Don't you think that if anyone was actually planning to turn the election with bags full of fake paper ballots, they would have figured out a way, Pat, to get those ballots in before Election Day, since usually ballots are only counted before Election Day? Like, every allegation of voter fraud from the right assumes everybody is stupid. They claim that people are swinging elections by doing in-person voter fraud, that individuals are showing up at polling places and voting twice, or voting as dead people, or as people that aren't actually them. That would be such a stupid way to steal an election. And likewise, the idea that Democrats planted countless fake paper ballots, enough to swing the election, but they were stupid enough to wait until after the election was over to claim that those ballots exist. You've got to be incredibly incompetent at trying to steal elections if this is what you're doing.
Yeah, and it's a totally fair argument to say that it's Monday. We shouldn't be still counting votes that were cast from last Tuesday. I mean, we should just know the results within 24 hours or so of the election. That's all well and good, because I think it can undermine their confidence in our electoral system. But what's not justifiable is to say that, well, these votes are coming in later, so therefore we just have to usurp the will of the people and that these votes are just not going to get counted. That's not the right way out of this.
Yes, and there are very clear rules about the postmark dates and all sorts of other stuff. Like, we can very easily figure this thing out. And that's actually, I want to talk to the reasonable people in the audience for a second. If you are reasonable, you probably have the view that we should be able to put political disagreements aside and just work together and figure out a simple way to make sure that there's a fair and equal standard so that everybody who is legally able to vote and votes is sure that their vote is counted and that nobody is scared away from voting legally. And you would be right. We should be able to do that. The reason we can't is that one party benefits from lower voter turnout. That's the Republican Party. That's why we can't fix it, because one party and one political movement, the American right wing, they don't want higher turnout. It's bad for their candidates. It's in one party's favor for everybody to vote, and it's in the other party's favor for people not to vote. Voting itself is now partisan, and we're really screwed if we can't figure that out and solve that problem. And unfortunately, I'm scared we can't, because the incentives are really clear and the stakes are too high. The right can't allow everybody to vote because they will get crushed. And that's why we have this situation. Okay, so let's continue our analysis and discussion of the firing, de facto firing, the forced resignation of Jeff Sessions, and the bringing in of Matthew Whitaker, who is unconstitutionally inserted by Donald Trump and causing all sorts of chaos involving both left-wing and right-wing legal scholars saying, you can't do this. You simply cannot do this. Many, many problems with Matthew Whitaker. He's in the tank on Russia. There's been this op-ed that he wrote, which now has been scrutinized. He wrote it on CNN, saying that the Mueller probe is wrong and it's bad and that he would end it by starving it of funds. The appointment itself unconstitutional, as I said. And we now have learned that back in 2014, he actually ran for the Republican Iowa, U.S. Senator from Iowa, Republican nomination back in 2014. And Matthew Whitaker said that judges without a New Testament biblical view of justice shouldn't serve on the federal bench. And he even went as far as to suggest that he'd try to prevent non-Christian judges from being appointed to the bench if he got a chance. And he is very close to getting that chance right now. Back when he was running for that Republican nomination in Iowa, he attended a forum that was hosted by the religious right group, The Family Leader. And a lot of crazy ideas, as you can probably imagine, were floated at that forum, including using God-given natural law to decide who would make good judges. Whitaker went even beyond that. Prepare yourself to be disgusted. During this forum, Matthew Whitaker said, while I agree that I want to understand their judicial philosophy and whether they understand natural law and natural rights, and then the founding documents and how they fit together, I don't think that gets us far enough, because natural law oftentimes is used from the eye of the beholder. What I'd like to see is things like their worldview. Are they people of faith? Do they have a biblical view of justice? I think that is very important. And the moderator interjected, Levitical or New Testament? This is code for, are Jews allowed? Levitical biblical code would include Jews because it's Old Testament. New Testament would also exclude Jews. And Matthew Whitaker said, I'm a New Testament. And what I know is, as long as they have that New Testament worldview, that they'll be a good judge. Later in this same forum, he also mentioned he would be extra concerned about atheists being judges, saying, quote, if they have a secular worldview, then I'm going to be very concerned about how they judge. This is against the Constitution of the United States, which says no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. This is against the stated mission of the Justice Department. This is against everything that the United States is supposed to be. And this is what the top law enforcer of the United States believes. This is his version. This is a Christian version of Sharia law. And we find so often, Pat, that it's okay for there to be no separation of church and state as long as it's their religion. But as soon as someone wants to swear on a Quran or doesn't believe in God, they should not be allowed. And this is so dangerous, and it just has to be stopped. I don't know how else to say it, Pat.
Right. Matt Whitaker could be more backwards and bigoted than even the last Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, even though Sessions is someone who said that he thinks the ACLU and the NAACP are un-American and that they try to force civil rights down our throats. We've mentioned over and over the comments about how he used to like the KKK before they started smoking pot. All that stuff is bad. Whitaker could end up topping that.
This is how we return to the Dark Ages, quite frankly, and why the developed world is laughing at us, which we're going to talk about in the next show. That's a piece I'm working on. This stuff is more in line with what happens in the countries that many Americans claim we are better than. A lot of the countries where you have people on the right saying, we can't allow them to come here because we are just so superior to them in every way. This is what they say, not what I say. This is the type of stuff that goes on in those countries. And in addition, a company that Whitaker was involved with as an advisor is under FBI investigation. They're putting in charge of the FBI a guy who has been advising a company that is being investigated by the FBI. The company is called World Patent Marketing. Whitaker was on the advisory board. They are under potential criminal investigation by the FBI right now. This must be stopped. This absolutely has to be stopped. And you know that this is starting to get to the White House and to Donald Trump, because Trump is now going into talking point comas, denying he even knows Matthew Whitaker. And those are the clips I want to get to next.